The courts of the Spanish Habsburg Monarchy were often presented to the outside world as spaces of refinement, ceremony, and divine order. Official portraits and diplomatic correspondence emphasized splendor, hierarchy, and continuity. Yet surviving administrative records, personal correspondence, and court regulations reveal a more constrained and controlled environment, particularly for the women who lived within these spaces. Their lives were shaped not only by status and privilege, but also by rigid systems of surveillance, obligation, and political expectation. Historical records indicate that the structure of the Habsburg court was defined by an intricate system of households, each governed by strict hierarchies and codified roles. Women of the court, whether queens, infantas, noble attendants, or servants, were integrated into this system through clearly defined positions that determined their movement, speech, and daily routines. The queen's household, in particular, functioned as both a domestic and political institution, where proximity to royal authority translated into influence, but also into increased scrutiny. Contemporary accounts describe how royal women rarely experienced solitude. Their daily lives unfolded in the presence of attendants, ladies-in-waiting, confessors, and officials responsible for enforcing court protocol. Privacy, in the modern sense, was largely absent. Even intimate moments, such as dressing, correspondence, and religious devotion, were often observed or regulated. This constant presence of others was not incidental but institutional, intended to preserve decorum, prevent scandal, and ensure that behavior aligned with the expectations of both monarchy and church. Surviving documents suggest that marriage played a central role in defining the lives of women at court. Dynastic strategy governed these unions, with negotiations often conducted years in advance and across vast political distances. Women were expected to serve as instruments of alliance, their personal preferences subordinate to the needs of the crown. Letters exchanged between courts reveal that these arrangements were evaluated in terms of territory, succession, and diplomatic advantage, rather than individual compatibility. Once married, queen's consort entered a highly regulated environment in which their primary responsibilities included producing heirs and maintaining the symbolic integrity of the monarchy. Chroniclers noted that the birth of a male heir was treated as a matter of state security, with elaborate rituals surrounding pregnancy and childbirth. Medical attendants, court officials, and even foreign ambassadors sometimes observed or reported on these events, underscoring their political significance. Legal codes of the period reveal that a queen's conduct was subject to both formal and informal oversight. Expectations of piety, modesty, and obedience were reinforced through religious instruction and court etiquette. Deviations from these norms could result in reputational damage or political consequences. In some cases, correspondence indicates that queens who failed to produce heirs or who were perceived as politically disruptive faced isolation or marginalization within the court. The experience of unmarried royal women, particularly infantas, followed a similarly structured path. While they could exercise influence through patronage and correspondence, their lives were often defined by waiting for a suitable marriage alliance or, in some cases, for a decision to enter a convent. Convents associated with the royal court functioned as both religious institutions and extensions of dynastic policy. Entry into such a convent did not necessarily signify withdrawal from political life. Rather, it could represent an alternative form of participation, with royal women maintaining networks of influence through letters and spiritual patronage. Chroniclers noted that the education of women at court emphasized religious instruction, language skills, and courtly behavior. Literacy was valued, particularly for its role in correspondence, but intellectual pursuits were generally framed within acceptable boundaries. Surviving letters demonstrate that some women developed sophisticated political awareness, engaging in discussions of diplomacy and governance. However, these activities were often conducted discreetly, reflecting the limitations imposed by gender norms. The physical spaces of the court further reinforced these structures of control. Architectural layouts of royal residences, including the Alcazar of Madrid, reveal a separation between public and private areas that was carefully managed. Women's quarters were often located in sections of the palace designed to limit unsupervised access. Movement between spaces required permission and was frequently accompanied by attendants. This spatial organization served both practical and symbolic purposes, reinforcing the notion that royal women were to be protected and simultaneously contained. Contemporary diplomatic reports provide additional insight into the perception of court life. Foreign envoys often commented on the formality and rigidity of Spanish court etiquette, noting the limited opportunities for informal interaction. For women, these constraints were even more pronounced. Social exchanges were governed by protocol, with gestures, speech, and even eye contact subject to regulation. Such practices were intended to maintain hierarchy and prevent any actions that might be interpreted as impropriety. Religious observance played a central role in structuring daily life. The influence of the Catholic Church within the Spanish Habsburg court was profound, shaping not only public ceremonies but also private routines. Confessors held significant authority, advising royal women on matters of conscience and behavior. Surviving records suggest that this relationship could extend into political domains, with spiritual guidance intersecting with decisions about patronage, correspondence, and even dynastic strategy. The emphasis on piety was not merely symbolic, but also disciplinary. Women were expected to demonstrate visible devotion through regular attendance at Mass, participation in religious festivals, and adherence to moral expectations. Chroniclers noted that deviations from these practices could attract criticism, both within the court and in broader society. The intersection of religious and political authority thus created an environment in which personal conduct was continuously evaluated. Servants and attendants within the court occupied a different, but equally regulated position. Many of these women came from noble families seeking advancement through proximity to the monarchy. Their roles required constant vigilance, as they were responsible for maintaining the routines and appearances of their superiors. Letters and administrative records indicate that competition for positions within the Queen's household could be intense, with appointments influenced by family connections and political considerations. Despite these constraints, surviving documents reveal moments of agency and negotiation. Women at court sometimes used their positions to advocate for family interests, secure patronage, or influence diplomatic outcomes. Correspondence between queens and foreign rulers demonstrates an awareness of political dynamics and an ability to engage with them strategically. However, such actions were typically conducted within the boundaries imposed by court protocol and gender expectations. The cumulative effect of these structures was a system in which visibility and restriction were closely intertwined. Royal women were central to the representation of monarchical power, yet their ability to act independently was limited by a network of regulations, expectations, and surveillance. Their lives were not defined solely by confinement, but neither were they characterized by the autonomy often associated with modern conceptions of power. Surviving records suggest that the psychological impact of this environment could be significant. Letters occasionally reference feelings of isolation, frustration, or resignation, though such expressions were often tempered by the conventions of the time. The absence of overt dissent in official sources should not be interpreted as evidence of contentment, but rather as an indication of the constraints on expression. In examining the lived realities of women within the Spanish Habsburg court, a consistent pattern emerges. A system designed to maintain order, preserve hierarchy, and protect dynastic interests, often at the expense of personal autonomy. The mechanisms of control were multifaceted, encompassing architecture, ritual, religion, and social expectation. Within this framework, women navigated a complex landscape in which influence was possible but always conditional, shaped by forces that extended far beyond individual choice. The expectations imposed upon women within the court of the Spanish Habsburg Monarchy did not operate in isolation, but were reinforced through an interlocking system of observation, reporting, and discipline. Surviving correspondence from ambassadors and court officials suggests that information about the conduct of royal women circulated continuously, often extending beyond the palace walls into diplomatic networks across Europe. Behavior within the court was therefore not only a matter of internal regulation, but also of international scrutiny. Contemporary diplomatic reports describe how ambassadors stationed in Madrid frequently relayed detailed observations about the Queen and her household. These reports included descriptions of health, temperament, religious devotion, and interpersonal relationships. Such information was treated as politically relevant, particularly when it related to the production of heirs or the stability of royal marriages. In this context, the personal lives of women at court became a form of state intelligence, subject to interpretation and, at times, misrepresentation. Surviving documents suggest that language barriers and cultural differences could could intensify the sense of isolation experienced by foreign-born queens. Many consorts arrived in Spain from other European courts, bringing with them distinct customs, languages, and expectations. Upon arrival, they were expected to adapt quickly to the formalized and often austere environment of the Spanish court. Letters written by such queens occasionally reference difficulties in communication and the absence of familiar social networks, indicating that adaptation was neither immediate nor without strain. The regulation of communication itself formed another mechanism of control. Correspondence was a vital tool for maintaining political alliances and personal relationships, yet it was also subject to oversight. Court protocols often required that letters pass through intermediaries or be reviewed before delivery. While not all correspondence was censored in a formal sense, the knowledge that communication could be monitored influenced how individuals expressed themselves. Surviving letters frequently employ cautious language, suggesting an awareness of potential scrutiny. Legal and administrative records reveal that reputation functioned as a critical currency within the court. For women, maintaining an unblemished public image was essential not only for personal standing, but also for the political interests of their families. Allegations of impropriety, even when unsubstantiated, could have lasting consequences. Chroniclers noted instances in which rumors or suspicions led to increased surveillance or restrictions on movement, demonstrating how informal mechanisms of control could operate alongside formal regulations. The role of ritual and ceremony further reinforced these dynamics. Court life was structured around a calendar of events, each governed by precise rules regarding participation, attire, and behavior. Women occupied prominent positions within these ceremonies, serving as visible symbols of dynastic continuity and moral order. However, this visibility also subjected them to constant evaluation. Every gesture, expression, and interaction was potentially subject to interpretation by observers both within and outside the court. Surviving descriptions of ceremonial life emphasize its repetitive and disciplined nature. Attendance at religious services, public audiences, and court festivities followed established patterns, leaving limited room for variation. For women, adherence to these routines was not optional but expected. Deviations could be interpreted as breaches of decorum or signs of dissent. In this way, ceremony functioned not only as a display of power, but also as a mechanism of regulation. Economic considerations also shaped the experiences of women within the court. While queens and high-ranking noblewomen had access to significant resources, these were often controlled through complex administrative systems. Financial records indicate that expenditures were monitored and allowances were allocated according to rank and function. Requests for additional funds or resources required approval, reinforcing dependence on the broader structures of authority. For lower-ranking attendants, economic security was closely tied to their position within the household, making dismissal or reassignment a matter of serious consequence. The intersection of gender and health provides further insight into the constraints of court life. Medical practices of the period, influenced by prevailing theories and limited knowledge, often placed additional burdens on women. Pregnancy, in particular, was treated as both a personal and political event, subject to intense oversight. Physicians, midwives, and court officials all played roles in managing and documenting these experiences. Surviving medical reports and correspondence suggest that treatments could be invasive and, at times, ineffective, reflecting the broader limitations of early modern medicine. Chroniclers noted that periods of illness could alter the balance of influence within the court. A queen's incapacity might shift attention toward other members of the royal family or key advisors, while recovery could restore her position. In this context, health was not merely a private matter, but a factor with potential political implications. Women were therefore expected to manage their public appearance carefully, even during times of physical difficulty. The upbringing of children within the court introduced another layer of complexity. Royal offspring, particularly male heirs, were often separated from their mothers at an early age and placed under the supervision of appointed guardians and tutors. This practice, intended to ensure proper education and control, limited the role of mothers in their children's daily lives. Letters and accounts from the period occasionally reflect a sense of distance in these relationships, though expressions of maternal concern remain evident. Education within the royal household emphasized discipline, religious instruction, and preparation for future roles. For daughters, This often meant preparation for marriage alliances or religious life, while sons were trained for governance. Women at court participated in this system primarily as overseers within defined boundaries, their influence mediated by male authorities and institutional structures. The presence of factions within the court further complicated the environment in which women operated. Noble families and political advisors formed networks of influence, often competing for access to the monarch and control over decision-making processes. Women, particularly those in close proximity to the queen, could become associated with these factions, whether intentionally or not. Surviving correspondence indicates that alliances were carefully managed, with individuals seeking to balance loyalty, ambition, and survival. In some cases, women acted as intermediaries within these networks, facilitating communication and negotiation. Their positions within the household provided access to information and individuals that might otherwise be difficult to reach. However, this role carried risks. Association with a particular faction could lead to consequences if political circumstances shifted. The need for caution is evident in the measured tone of many surviving letters, which avoid explicit statements of allegiance. Religious institutions continued to exert significant influence over the lives of court women. Confessors and spiritual advisors were not only concerned with matters of faith, but also with behavior and decision-making. Their guidance could shape daily routines, interpersonal relationships, and even political actions. Surviving records suggest that the authority of these figures was widely accepted, reflecting the broader integration of religious and secular power within the Spanish monarchy. The cumulative evidence from administrative records, correspondence, and contemporary accounts points to a system in which control was maintained through a combination of visibility, regulation, and expectation. Women within the court were essential to its functioning, yet their roles were carefully circumscribed. Opportunities for influence existed, but they required navigation of a complex and often restrictive environment. Over time, these conditions contributed to a broader pattern in which the experiences of women at the Spanish Habsburg court reflected both the possibilities and limitations of their position. Their lives were shaped by forces that extended beyond individual circumstances, rooted in the political, religious, and social structures of the period. Within this framework, personal agency was neither absent nor absolute, but negotiated within boundaries that were consistently reinforced through the mechanisms of the court itself. The cumulative pressures of life within the court of the Spanish Habsburg Monarchy became more visible when examined across longer periods of time, particularly through patterns of withdrawal, adaptation, and institutional continuity. Surviving records from the later decades of Habsburg rule indicate that the structures governing women's lives remained remarkably consistent, even as the political and economic position of the monarchy began to weaken. This continuity suggests that the regulation of court life was not merely a reflection of external strength, but a deeply embedded system of governance. Historical records indicate that, as Spain's imperial resources came under strain in the 17th century, court expenditure was increasingly scrutinized. Financial constraints affected all levels of the royal household, including the provision of clothing, stipends, and ceremonial functions. For women within the court, these changes could alter daily routines and expectations. Inventories and account books reveal reductions in luxury goods and adjustments to household staffing, yet the emphasis on maintaining outward decorum persisted. Even under economic pressure, the symbolic role of royal women required the preservation of appearance and ritual. Contemporary accounts describe how this tension between material limitation and ceremonial expectation created a more restrictive environment. The need to uphold dignity with fewer resources placed additional burdens on those responsible for managing households, particularly senior women overseeing attendants and servants. Correspondence from court officials suggests that disputes over allocation of resources became more frequent, reflecting both scarcity and the continued importance of hierarchy. Surviving documents also suggest that patterns of withdrawal into religious life became more pronounced among certain royal and noble women. Entry into convents, long an established option, increasingly functioned as both a personal and political resolution. These institutions offered a structured environment that mirrored aspects of court life, hierarchy, discipline, and routine, while providing a degree of separation from the direct pressures of dynastic politics. However, this separation was not absolute. Royal convents maintained close ties to the monarchy, and women within them often continued to participate in networks of influence through correspondence and patronage. Chroniclers noted that the decision to enter a convent was not always voluntary in the modern sense. Family strategy, political calculation, and personal circumstance all played roles. For some women, it represented a form of stability within a system that offered limited alternatives. For others, it may have been experienced as a continuation of the same structures of control encountered within the court. The distinction between withdrawal and reassignment, therefore, is not always clear in the surviving sources. The experiences of widowed queens further illustrate the constrained nature of autonomy within the Habsburg system. Widowhood could, in theory, provide a degree of independence, as the immediate obligation to produce heirs no longer applied. However, records indicate that widowed queens were often expected to maintain a visible role within the court or retire into religious settings aligned with dynastic interests. Their households remained subject to regulation, and their actions continued to carry political significance, particularly in matters of regency or advisory influence. Legal frameworks of the period reveal that authority remained concentrated within male-dominated institutions, even when women held positions of prominence. Queens acting as regents, for example, operated within carefully defined limits, their decisions subject to oversight by councils and advisors. Surviving decrees and council records suggest that while such women could exercise considerable influence, their authority was often framed as temporary or conditional, reinforcing broader norms regarding gender and governance. The physical and social isolation experienced by many women at court is further reflected in patterns of illness and mortality documented in medical and administrative records. Early modern medical practices, combined with the demands of repeated pregnancies and limited understanding of disease, contributed to high rates of health complications. Reports of prolonged illness, difficult childbirths, and early deaths appear with notable frequency in court archives. These records, while often clinical in tone, underscore the physical toll associated with the expectations placed upon royal women. Chroniclers occasionally recorded public responses to these events, noting periods of mourning, religious observance, and ceremonial commemoration. Such reactions reinforced the symbolic role of royal women as embodiments of dynastic continuity. Yet they also reveal how individual lives were integrated into broader narratives of monarchy and faith, their personal experiences subsumed within collective ritual. The role of memory and representation further shaped how these women were understood both during their lifetimes and in subsequent historical accounts. Portraiture, official chronicles, and religious dedications emphasized virtues such as piety, obedience, and fertility. These representations were not neutral but constructed, reflecting the values and priorities of the court. Surviving visual and textual materials suggest that deviations from these ideals were often minimized or omitted, contributing to a curated image of royal life. At the same time, less formal sources, private letters, marginal notes, and administrative complaints offer glimpses of alternative perspectives. These documents reveal tensions, frustrations, and moments of negotiation that are less visible in official narratives. While such sources are fragmentary, they provide important context for understanding the lived realities behind the formal structures of the court. The transition from the Habsburg to the Bourbon dynasty at the beginning of the 18th century introduced changes to the organization of the Spanish court, yet many underlying practices persisted. Early Bourbon reforms sought to streamline administration and reduce some of the rigidity associated with Habsburg ceremonial life. However, the fundamental principles governing the roles of women, emphasis on dynastic marriage, regulation of behavior, and integration into political structures, remained largely intact. Surviving records from this transitional period suggest that while certain aspects of court life became less formalized, the expectations placed upon women continued to reflect long-standing traditions. The persistence of these norms indicates that they were not solely products of a particular dynasty, but part of a broader cultural and institutional framework within early modern Europe. Over the course of the Habsburg period, the experiences of women within the Spanish court were shaped by a system that combined visibility with restriction, influence with limitation, and privilege with obligation. Their roles were essential to the functioning of the monarchy, yet their capacity for independent action was consistently mediated by structures designed to preserve order and continuity. Historical analysis of these patterns reveals that the court functioned as both a center of power and a site of regulation, where individual lives were closely integrated into the needs of the state. For women, this integration created a reality in which personal identity and public role were difficult to separate. The expectations placed upon them extended beyond individual circumstances, reflecting broader assumptions about gender, authority, and the nature of monarchy. The surviving evidence does not support a singular interpretation of their experiences. Instead, it points to a spectrum of responses shaped by position, personality, and context. Some women appear to have navigated the system with a degree of effectiveness, leveraging their roles to influence political and social outcomes. Others seem to have experienced the constraints more acutely, their opportunities limited by circumstance and expectation. What remains consistent across these variations is the presence of a highly structured environment in which autonomy was negotiated rather than assumed. The mechanisms of control, architectural, ceremonial, religious, and administrative, operated together to define the boundaries within which women lived and acted. These mechanisms were not static, but adapted over time, responding to changes in political conditions while maintaining core principles. In examining the long-term effects of this system, it becomes evident that the experiences of women at the Spanish Habsburg court cannot be understood solely in terms of confinement or privilege. Instead, they reflect a complex interplay of power, duty, and limitation, embedded within a broader historical context that prioritized stability and continuity over individual freedom. The legacy of these structures extends beyond the period itself, influencing both historical memory and modern interpretations of royal life. By focusing on the documented realities of governance, daily routine, and institutional control, a more nuanced understanding emerges. One that recognizes the central role of women within the monarchy while acknowledging the constraints that shaped their existence.